tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage to the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the fully enlightened One. Today I would like to give a talk on the teachings of the Buddha, or the Buddhist religion. And Buddhism is one of the major religions in the world. And Buddhism was taught by one of the greatest sages that India ever produced, Siddhartha Gautama. He was called the Buddha. The Buddha is not the name of a person, but the Buddha means a title. Is a title meaning one who is awake, one who is awakened in the very deepest sense of the word. And strictly speaking, the Buddha didn't teach Buddhism, but he taught the Dhamma, or Dharma as it's pronounced in Sanskrit. And Dhamma is a word that has very many profound meanings, from the gross, mundane objects of the world to the subtlest spiritual truths. And one aspect of the Dhamma also means the laws of nature, the laws of nature that govern the operation and the workings of the body and mind and its interaction with the world. So Buddha taught these laws of nature, which can also include the nature of suffering, how suffering arises and how suffering can be overcome and cease altogether. But one has to understand the nature of suffering, and the laws of nature that produce suffering, and then live in harmony with those laws of nature in order to bring suffering to an end. Some people call Buddhism a religion, and others may call it a philosophy. But if we examine the earliest texts, we'll see that it's probably most appropriately described as a psychology, or even a psychotherapy. It does deal with religious values, and it deals with philosophy and social and economic problems, but it does so by bringing all of those into the field of psychology and solving them as psychological problems. And the Buddhism is a religion that is not centered around the idea of a God. It's not theocentric. But the Buddhist teachings grew up to satisfy the deep human need. So it's more of an anthropomorphic approach. It is centered around the needs of the man. It's not something that has come down from heaven to fulfill some divine purpose, but it's something that has grown up here on earth to solve the profoundest of the human needs, and that is the need to overcome suffering. For the Buddha, religion is something that derives from our need for happiness, and to attain happiness, and to live in a state of happiness. And it's not based on fear or punishment. That the Dhamma is based on understanding the laws of nature that govern our mind and govern the interaction of the world around us. So it's based on understanding the laws of cause and effect, and what actions bring us suffering and which actions bring us happiness. So the Buddhist teachings are based on understanding the mind and understanding the interconnectedness and the interdependence of all things around us. And I want to just briefly touch on this, the definition of the word Dhamma, of meaning the laws of nature. So just as we have the physical laws of physics, such as if you throw an object down, if you throw an object up into the air, it comes back down. It's the law of gravity. And in the same way, the law of Dhamma, if we throw something out of our body, speech, or mind, it will come back to us in one way or another. This is a natural law, often called the law of karma. So if we act or speak with an impure state of mind, then suffering will come back to us in one way or another. If we act or speak with a pure state of mind, then happiness will follow, as a shadow follows you without departing. These are two verses of the Dhammapada, which is a famous Buddhist text. So for the Buddha, the mind is all important. That we either create suffering for ourselves or we create happiness for ourselves. And it all depends on our understanding of the world and our relationship to the world. So for the Buddhist, the Buddha didn't regard man as a sinner who is incapable of anything else but asking the Creator for forgiveness. But through using all of the natural intelligence that we have, that we were born with, that we can use that intelligence to cultivate the right understanding of the world and live in harmony with the way the world is. Some of the laws of nature are that everything is changing, everything is impermanent. But we wish that everything was not changing. Or the way we live our life, we live it with the idea that, the wish that things would be permanent and not change. And so when change happens, we get frustrated, and because of our clinging and not allowing things to change, we suffer on account of that. So one of the natural laws of nature is that everything is changing and arising due to causes and conditions. So when we understand that, we can live our life in a more light-hearted way and not be so grasping after things of the world. Another one of the profound laws of nature is that happiness is already right within ourself. That most people live their life depending on external things to provide their happiness and comfort. And so most people think that happiness is somehow created. And they try to do many things to be happy, to create happiness. But the Buddha saw that this was a fundamental flaw, that happiness is already the natural state of the mind when it's at complete rest and harmony with nature around it. But somehow we've lost touch with that inner reality. We've lost touch with that inherent inner state of peace and tranquility. And we become overly dependent on the external world to provide our satisfaction and happiness. So our mind is totally focused in the outside world. and we live for trying to bring the outside world into us to make us feel more fulfilled or happy. And it's a fundamental law that all beings are seeking to be happy. And it even says that in our Constitution or the Bill of Rights, that all men are created equal and are striving after life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So all beings are seeking to live in a state of happiness and to be free from pain. But the idea of happiness for each person is different. And each person will have a different idea of how they can create that happiness. But usually it depends on the external world, material things. If I can only have, a lot of money and be able to do anything I want, then I could really be happy. Or if I have the perfect family that doesn't cause me any problems and becomes the perfect family and intelligent children, then I could be really happy. Or if the government does all the things that I want, then I'll be happy. But anyway, or we're seeking the sensual pleasure and satisfaction, and depending on the objects of the world of sensual satisfaction. But all these things are changing. This comes into conflict with impermanence. So we have a lot of desires, and most of those desires are based on trying to achieve happiness and to avoid pain. And in the process of satisfying that desire for pleasure and the desire for happiness, we may infringe on the rights of others, and we become dominated by desire and greed for the external world. And so that clouds our mind, and we could take all different measures to satisfy that craving, even to the extent of killing others, abusing others, lying, stealing, deceiving, and in so many other ways, inflicting harm on others, all in the name of attaining happiness and trying to fulfill our desires. But because everything is changing, they cannot be fulfilled. And desire is something that can never be fulfilled because the nature of impermanence. Whenever we get a certain object or pleasure, then it very quickly changes. Or our mind also changes and loses interest in it very quickly, because even our mind is always changing. So once we've attained an object of our desire, that object changes, and so we need something else. And so we go on seeking more things. So the problem boils down to one of having excessive and unrealistic desires and not being able to satisfy those desires. So suffering arises on account of not being able to satisfy the unsatiable desires. It's not having the means to satisfy our wants, but it's having the unrealistic desire and the unsatiable desire for those wants that becomes the fundamental problem. And this is the problem that the Buddha discovered, the primary psychological problem of dukkha, or suffering, that we're usually unsatisfied, and we're always seeking to fill our dissatisfaction with trying to manipulate the external world in one way or another and to satisfy those cravings and aversions as well. Because the world is always changing, we come up against all kinds of unpleasant stimulations, and the mind fights against them, reacts against them. And this also produces conflicts. In order to get away from unpleasant feelings, unpleasant situations, things we don't like, we'll also resort to killing, lying, stealing, cheating, and so many other unwholesome actions, which then brings their result, coming back to the natural laws of cause and effect. If we act or speak with an impure state of mind, then suffering will come back to us in one form or another. So, in this sense, the whole problem of life boils down to one of the psychological problem. How to purify our mind of greed, hatred, and delusion, and of the unrealistic desires. And learning how to tap in to that fundamental ground of being or source of the pure mind of happiness that's already right within ourself. And so this is the teaching of the Buddha and the teaching of the Dhamma, the teachings of Dhamma, is a way to train our mind and body in order to conform more realistically with the laws of nature, and to tap into that source of happiness that's already right within ourself. The Buddha's teachings have been put into a framework called the Four Noble Truths. It has the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth that suffering can be brought to an end by eliminating the cause, and the fourth noble truth is the way to live and think and meditate, which will bring about the end of the causes of suffering. And the Buddha was like a great doctor. He's often referred to as the great doctor. But in this sense, the doctor of the mind. Just as if you have an illness and you go to the doctor and you tell him what your symptoms are, then he diagnoses those symptoms and then comes up with the cause of that suffering. And then he prescribes a cure, a medicine, to overcome the suffering. So the truth of suffering is universal, and it's everywhere around us. The Buddha defines suffering as birth is suffering, sickness is suffering, disease is suffering, old age, lamentation, grief, pain, and despair, and death are suffering. And then he went on to say, not getting what you want is suffering, and getting what you don't want is suffering. So this is the deepest level of suffering, not getting what you want and getting what you don't want. So we can see that all over is the nature of people's suffering, their unfulfilled desires. But it's also the physical kinds of pain and suffering that arise on account of trying to fulfill those unrealistic desires and satisfy a craving. So the Buddha diagnosed suffering and came up with the cause of suffering, which he defined as craving. The craving or unrealistic desires, unsatiated craving, and the ignorance, not knowing the truth from where it comes from, is the cause of suffering. And the Buddha also saw, and through his own experience of enlightenment, that the Buddha himself came and discovered the end of suffering. And so did many other enlightened sages of the time, his disciples. That if you have a cause of something, if you remove that cause, then the symptoms disappear. So if the cause of conflict and suffering is ignorance and craving or unrealistic desires, then by developing wisdom and overcoming those unrealistic desires, then we can arrive at a state of happiness. And then the Buddha prescribed the medicine, just as a doctor would prescribe a medicine to cure different sicknesses. The Buddha prescribed the medicine of the Dharma, and specifically of the medicine of the Noble Eightfold Path. So you have the general symptoms, which is any kind of physical or mental suffering. The Buddha diagnosed that all those symptoms arise from the essential cause of desire and ignorance. But desire and ignorance can be brought to an end by taking the medicine of the Dhamma. And so in this way, the Dhamma is something that we have to practice. That just if your sickness, if the doctor prescribes some medicine and you don't want to take the medicine, then you may not get well. So in the same way, if you just treat religion, from the Buddhist point of view, if you treat religion as just a philosophy, something you to believe in, but you don't practice it, then you won't get the benefits from it. So Buddhism has also been called a way of life, that we have to live according to the way that we believe. In other words, we have to walk the talk. If we really want to bring an end to suffering, we have to do the fundamental things that will bring that about. So for the Buddhist, we don't worry about the future, but the whole practice is about paying attention to our mind here and now. And by the development of meditation, by the practice of mindfulness, we can become aware of our impulses and cravings that cause us to keep on repeating the same sorts of habits, bodily habits, and speech, and thoughts that keep the mind in repeating its same mistakes over and over again and bringing about more conflicts and suffering. So meditation is really the key for transforming the mind from one of ignorance to one of wisdom, and transforming the mind, the roots, causes in the mind that bring suffering, and replacing them with the root causes in the mind which bring peace and happiness. And Buddhism is also not a mysticism or escaping into any type of trances, but it's a clear awareness of what is going on in our mind from moment to moment. And it is using that moment-to-moment clarity and attention to guide our actions in our life, which will conform in more harmony with the laws of cause and effect and with the nature around us. Buddhism also emphasizes the development of love and compassion for all beings, because all beings, just as oneself, also suffer. And all beings have a right to live in a state of peace and happiness without our infringing that right through our excessive desires and self-centeredness. So in Buddhism, we also cultivate a profound respect for all forms of life, and that we ourselves are just another part of nature that also is under the same laws of cause and effect that all other beings are. So in short, I would like to close this talk with another phrase of the Buddha, which simply states that do all good, refrain from evil, and purify the mind. This is the teaching of all the Buddhas.